Hi. On behalf of the Higher House Museum and the Bipartisan Policy Center, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for Once Upon an American Dream, Navigating the System Then and Now. This is the second part of our three-part panel series exploring the stages of the immigrant experience in America. Today we're focusing on the theme of arrival. My name's Kim Bender, and I'm the Executive Director of the Higher House Museum in Washington, D.C. Our museum is located in the home of Christian Heyrick, DC's most successful historic brewer, who immigrated to the US in 1866. Our museum uses Heyrick's legacy to explore the theme of the American dream. And when we first imagined this program, it was supposed to take place in our conservatory with beer, and hopefully all of you at home have a little drink in your hand for this 4 o'clock happy hour. It's because of our awesome partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center that we were able to quickly change to this format. During our first panel discussion, which was about the theme of migration, we showed a brief video that narrated Heyrick's migration to America after the Civil War to give us some historic perspective. And you can check out that video on our YouTube page at Heyrick House. We're foregoing a video for today's program because Heyrick's arrival in the United States only parallels a portion of the Black arrival experience in America. Black immigration is not a monolithic experience. Yet while Black people have come from all over the world to America in historic waves, like all immigration waves, we know that unlike other immigrants, Black people have not always come to America voluntarily. Discussions of historic Black migration has to include unfreed journeys, as well as migrations within the United States. Voluntary immigration of Black people to the US in waves that paralleled the mid-19th century wave of German Americans like Heyrick didn't happen until the second half of the 20th century, after the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 ended de facto discrimination against non-Western European immigrants. According to a Pew Research Center analysis of US Census data in 2015, 3.8 million Black immigrants lived in the United States and accounted for 8.7% of the nation's Black population, nearly triple the numbers from 1980. So I'm personally very excited to hear these panelists talk about this topic, and I'm going to pass it over to them. But before I do that, I just want to remind you that you can follow along on social media. Check out hashtag Once Upon an American Dream and hashtag BPC Live. And if you want to ask questions, you can do that directly on the BPC Facebook and YouTube live streams. So now I'm going to throw it over to our moderator, Alan Orr, who is the president-elect of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Alan?
Hi, thank you. I'm very excited to be here to actually help moderate this panel and conversation. I want to introduce the rest of the panel and then jump right into the conversation because we have a lot to talk about, and hopefully you'll have a lot of answers to sort of quiz us on our knowledge and sort of build a better understanding around the group. First, on our panel, we have Dr. Anthony Green, who's the Associate Professor of African American Studies at the College of Charleston. We also have Mr. May Yang Kerr, who is the founder of 735 Coffee, the Face of Sudan. And we also have Teresa Cardinal Brown, who is the Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Group. And let's start with Teresa. Teresa, can you tell us a little bit of the history of Black immigration to the U.S.? When and where did it start?
Of Black migration in the United States was not voluntary migration. Enslaved Africans came to the United States with the first settlers in the 17th century, and really much for the first 250 years of the United States history, Black migration was involuntary migration. The real beginning of voluntary Black migration started after the Civil War. The first national immigration law, the Naturalization Act of 1870, was the first one that addressed immigration on a national basis. Prior to that, most immigration was regulated by the states themselves. In the Naturalization Act of 1870, naturalization, that is the ability to become a U.S. citizen, was extended to aliens, quote, aliens being free white persons, and to aliens of African nativity, and to persons of African descent to acquire citizenship in the United States. And as a post-Civil War measure, along with the 14th Amendment, this extended the ability not only to acquire birthright citizenship to the descendants of enslaved people, but also for African and other African descendants to acquire citizenship by naturalization. Theoretically, at this time, immigration from Africa and the Caribbean and other parts of the world was permitted except for Asia. Asians were considered non-white persons at that time. Immigration from many other countries of the world can increase throughout the late 1800s in the United States, again, with the exception of Asian immigration. But there were a lot more restrictions that came in the first part of the 20th century. The Chinese Exclusion Act first came about in 1882, which prohibited the importation of all Chinese laborers. And the Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924, in effect, that were in effect until 1965, restricted immigration from any country to 3% of the number of people from that country living in the United States as of the census of 1910. And that was later rescinded to 2% of the census of 1890. This basically prevented migration from most places of the world except for Northern and Western Europe. For example, under that system from 1924, the quota for immigrants from all of Africa, excluding Egypt, was 1,100. It was increased to 1,400 in 1952. By contrast, Germany had a quota of 51,000. So that tells you what those acts intended to do. In spite of this, about 140,000 Black immigrants came to the United States between 1899 and 1937, in spite of these restrictive immigration laws. Many of these were higher educated, literate immigrants and professionals, white collar workers from the Caribbean and from Africa, and many of them came as students because following the 1921 Act, students were considered non-immigrants and therefore exempted from the quotas and limitations. And many Black immigrants came to the United States in that time and were present during the quote unquote Harlem Renaissance of the early 1920s. In 1935, Congress passed something called the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, which regulated the importation of workers, but excluded farm workers and domestic labor. And that was another avenue by which some Black migration happened to the United States. I would say that following 1965, that was really the first turning point for the modern era of Black migration to the United States. The 1965 Act repealed the racial-based and nationality-based quotas from the early 20th century and gave every country 7% of the overall annual quota of immigration. It prioritized family-based migration. Over 60% of the green cards issued under this law went to relatives of US citizens and other green card holders already in the United States. At that time, because there was a smaller Black diaspora in the United States, migration from other Black immigrants really didn't take off until later in the century. But it did begin employment-sponsored immigration and, as I mentioned, students. And that set the stage for what we've seen as a consistent migration of, frankly, higher educated Black migrants from Africa. Black migration in the United States really took off after 1980 and the Refugee Act, which separated refugee determinations from Cold War politics and opened refugee status to people from places that had seen civil wars or other government unrest, including many of the countries in Africa. And then the Immigration Act of 1990 created the Diversity Visa Program. This program allocates 50,000 green cards annually by a lottery run by the State Department to individuals from countries that have seen lower levels of immigration to the United States in recent history. This opened the door to much higher rates of African and Caribbean migration to the United States. In 2016, almost 4 out of every 10 of those visas were granted to nationals of African countries. And African-born persons have been the most applicants in the diversity visa since 2013. As Kim mentioned, as Kim mentioned, Black immigration has grown substantially. And we're now at about 4 million Black foreign-born immigrants in the United States right now.
That's great. So, Dr. Green, can you help us understand who the Black immigrants are? And is there a difference between Black immigrants that come from different hemispheres?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Teresa mentioned a lot of information and detail that I was actually going to touch on, but it all flows together. Um, Many scholars identify Black immigrants or children of Black immigrants or children of immigrants in general as someone not born in the United States and or having at least one parent not born in the United States. And so we have, particularly in fields like sociology, for example, which is where my training is, we have first generation, 1.5 generation, second generation, and beyond. And so we're now in, I guess you could say, an era where we're seeing more and more children of Black immigrants. And they are as diverse as any other pan-ethnic group. It's unfortunate because of the chasm of race in America. We tend to lump, everyone into these specific categories of Black, white, Asian, Latino, on down the line. And so you'll find that, there are Afro Mexicans, there's Afro Cuban, Afro Brazilian, Nigerian and South African are very different. But somehow, when they come to the United States, we lump them into this one category of Black, and we create this monolithic system of belief about, Black people in general are relatively all the same. But Black immigrants and Black people are as diverse as any population of immigrants throughout the United States. Henry Louis Gates, professor of African American Studies at Harvard University, once said, if there are 40 million Black people in the United States, there are 40 million different ways of being Black. And so we're talking culturally, linguistically. Are there commonalities? Absolutely. We see some overlap in terms of shared histories. But Black immigrants are extremely diverse. And it is unfortunate that we tend to lump them into this one racial category of Black and assume that because they have melanated skin, that the experience is all the same. They react and interact with one another the same. That the experiences with racism, for example, is all the same. Part of my research looks at how racism differs between these particular groups, whether it be African groups, Caribbean groups, South American groups, Black Americans, on down the line. And so throughout the diaspora, the Caribbean, Central and South America, throughout Europe, at the College of Charleston last semester, one of my colleagues taught a course called Afro Germans. Right, and so the course is all about the lineage and legacy of Afro Germans and their lived experiences. So again, if we want to look at diversity and if we want to embrace diversity, we have to stop lumping Black people from all over the globe into this one category of being Black. We simply don't do that with many other groups. We give distinct ethnic identifiers to Cubans in Miami, Puerto Ricans in New York, Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. But somehow, if you're a Black immigrant, you're just Black in America. And that's unfortunate. And again, there's a lot of research out here who's continuing to expand these ideas about how Black immigrants and Black people in general are experiencing their ethnic identity and are experiencing life in general.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kirk, could you sort of tell us a little bit about your immigrant history and your identity as Black in the United States?
Thank you so much. So the first 3 weeks after I come to America, I was put into a group home called Virginia Home for Boy and Girl. So when I put in that group home, I was asked, that group home usually help you find a job and all that. So a friend of mine, his name is Jeremy, was helping me filling application. Mostly people who live in that group home are um, African Americans, young adults who are from age of 15 to 16 and 18. So when we filling out application, he was helping me. My English was not great at the time, so I need somebody that can help me. I still have struggling on saying some words, but I tried my best. But he was helping me fill out applications, and when we fill out the application, and then I finish mine, and the part that say, "What are you?" and then everything in black and is in one place. So and then he go and fill his application again, and he go in and the same question come to him, "What are you?" And then he say, and he click the area, the part that I click. I was very confused, and I asked him, "What are you?" And he say that, "Well, I'm in the same boat as you. I mean, same table, bro." And I was like, "Oh, so I thought you were American, man." He said, "I am, but in that job application, we are in the same table." So it's a joke that we make when we go to college. We say, "Well, the same table." We have that kind of joke. So that's my experience of, is is the same. I mean, we have a different a different. Uh, I mean, you start in the same level a little bit more, different experience, different thing, but there are a lot of culture that are also different too. So that's a bit
And
about
what
me.
avenue did you use to, yeah, what avenue did you use to immigrate to the United States?
So
Uh,
I come as a refugee from Sudan.
in what year?
I I come in 2006.
2006. And
Yeah,
you arrived in what city?
Richmond. So my
Richmond.
Richmond, Virginia.
And how was it to be a black immigrant in Richmond, Virginia? How were you perceived by Virginians?
Well, I mean, it's a little. I mean, I wouldn't say that my experience has been worse because some people had a worse experience, but you can see that at the end of the day, if something happened to black, you're going to be black. It doesn't really matter what you're going to be because I started in a group home, and the more kid I see in that group home were mostly 80% black, and there's some Spanish there. But growing up in that group home is like you highly going to go to jail. You highly likely not going to get a good job that is paying you better because you may just get a job at the Lowe's or Walmart or something. So our startup is like they live here for a very long time, and we're gonna start up together now, like in a group home area. So it's difficult for us, to loan. Of course, I started the business, 734. Getting a loan is very, very hard. Just imagine that getting a loan. And when I struggled to go to also trying to get into college, I couldn't get a recommendation letter because I live in a group home and no one know me for a long time. Those are the things that also push your experience is going to fall down into the same experience as a black person in the country because they also facing the same thing. Some people just say, "Man, I live in a group home. How can I go to college?" And that is true because everything that you see through that perspective, and that has been my experience coming here.
Thank you. Dr. Green, what similarities does Mr. Kerr's story sort of speak to for blacks and then for black immigrants?
Well, again, the boxes that we've created in terms of the construction of race in America. If you have dark skin, black skin, you are immediately linked to being black, and so I would argue overall as black immigrants, that is something that at some point in time that they are likely to experience. And some of the things that I've uncovered in my own research, there have been ways in which black immigrants have chosen to disassociate themselves with being identified as black American. And some of those ways are linguistically, for example. But as Mr. Kerr said, that doesn't exclude them from understanding, at least being, immersed into American culture and understanding what black means. And oftentimes in American society, most times in American society, black is often equated with negative, whether that be negative images, negative expectations, negative behaviors, so forth and so on. But I will say the experience for black immigrants in terms of refugees are pretty, again, like Mr. Kerr said, they're going to be individuals who have better and worse experiences than himself. But as a refugee, there's a particular experience. And as it was mentioned in the opening statements, there's a very big difference between voluntary and involuntary immigration. And so Black immigrants who post-1965, post-1980, post-1990, particularly those who have come in the voluntary form, some of their experiences are very different. We have to also keep in mind that we have to move beyond this idea of the poor immigrant. There is a significant number of immigrants who come to the United States who, again, as it was mentioned earlier, very well educated, have white collar occupations, come here for education, higher education. And so you see those experience, middle class. I meant to say that many are coming as middle class. So coming as a middle class, educated, white collar professional immigrant, your experiences are going to be very different than coming as a refugee. And that's to be expected. And so on the other side of this conversation, we have to think about how America receives the very vast differences in immigrants. The mode of incorporation and the context of reception is what we call it in sociology. If the context of reception is welcoming, positive, resources are made available, then we see the natural progression and matriculation of immigrant populations moving into, again, white collar occupations, middle class jobs, living, quote unquote, the American dream. But if the context of reception is met with resistance or hesitance, fueled by structural forms as well as individual forms of racism, then their experiences are not going to be as smooth. And one of the best examples of that are Haitians in Miami. I did my graduate studies at the University of Miami, and you clearly saw the vast differences of how Haitian immigrants were treated versus, for example, Cuban immigrants. And it was socially acceptable. It was a part of the culture of South Florida that the way in which authority figures, resources that are made available to Cuban immigrants was very different than Haitian immigrants. So much so that it was a law or a policy that was created called the wet foot, dry foot law, right? That it extended its welcoming and context of reception for Cuban immigrants if they made it to land and had literally, if you put one foot on the ground, it could be in Key West, and as long as it's the United States, you would be granted automatic processes to apply for citizenship. But if that law didn't apply to Haitian immigrants, right? So if a Haitian immigrant was to step foot on American soil, he or she would still be detained, and oftentimes detained 6 months to a year, and eventually sent back to Haiti. And so the experiences are very. Yes,
no, I was saying that's a good point for sort of like Teresa. Okay.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Go ahead, Doctor.
Yeah. So I think this is a good point for Teresa to sort of talk about some of the barriers that Black immigrants face coming to the United States today, sort of off of this sort of disparity that was between the Cuban and the Haitians, to sort of give us a lay of the land of today.
Yes.
Yes, as Dr. Green said, American policy, particularly when it came to the Cubans, was immensely infected by the Cold War, and they did have a special pathway to asylum and citizenship that was not available to similarly situated asylum seekers from any other part of the world, including from Haiti, such that in the early 2000s, there was actually legislation passed in Congress to try to rectify some of this and give some of those Haitians that arrived at the same time a pathway to citizenship. Those kind of one-off pieces of legislation that were meant to rectify some of those injustices have been few in immigration law history, and in the last 20 years or so have not happened at all. But the fact that Congress did have to pass a special law recognizing that Haitians were treated differently and maybe potentially racist and unfair ways. As I mentioned, though, the history of our immigration laws include overt and outright racism, not just to Black immigrants, but to Asian immigrants as well. And I think it's important to understand that when I mentioned the 1965 Act, at the time it was seen as a pinnacle part of the civil rights movement. It was repealing racist in quotas, national quotas. But the fact that 60% of the visas were made available to family-based migrants, according to the congressional discussion around the bill, was aimed essentially at keeping the migration flows mostly from Northern and Western Europe, i.e., mostly white. So, as a way of bringing on Southern Democrats, they intended to try to keep that immigration flow as white as possible. It didn't work out that way. The 1965 Act actually did open immigration to the United States to people from many other places in the world. And we have seen a very big diversity in migration flows since then, including Black migrants from many places in the world, including Central and South America, the Caribbean, African, and other places.
So some of the challenges that they may have now, there's certain bans that are sort of keeping Black immigrants from coming more so than it is for other populations that are in place today, or?
Yes. So, the Trump administration, in its first acts after inauguration, issued what we know now as the Muslim ban or the travel ban, and originally aimed at majority Muslim countries. After its third iteration, and a trip to the Supreme Court was put in place with bans against 13 countries, several of which are in Africa, including Nigeria, the largest sender of migrants from Africa to the United States. Mm-hmm. So that has had a significant impact on the most recent migration. Add to that, as a result of COVID, more recently, a couple months ago, the United States, President Trump issued a suspension of all immigrant visas for anyone outside the United States in most visa categories, including essentially canceling this year's diversity visa lottery. So many immigrants who would otherwise be coming into the United States this year are not able to come, including many Black migrants from around the world. So those actions are having a disproportionate effect probably on Black migrants from many places in the world. Additionally, he has completely reduced the number of refugees allowed to be resettled in the United States each year. In the last year of the Obama administration, 110,000 refugees were allowed to be resettled from around the world. This last year, it was supposed to be 18,000. But again, due to restrictions under COVID, only a few hundred refugees have been resettled this particular year. And so again, major limitations on those who might come, like Mr. Khan, through the refugee program to the United States. So recent policies, particularly in this administration, have had, I think, a very disproportionate impact on Black migration to the United States.
So, Mr. Kerr, you've been here for at least a decade, and you're a Black business owner perceived in the United States. I believe that's what they would say, that it's a Black business. So what is your experience now sort of interacting with native-born Black people in the United States?
Just learning it from when I started from a group home. So I see the difference from the start and how things going to be from when I get the orientation to come to America, where you going to live. And Alan said something about there is a difference between migrant from this part of. This is really true because some of this thing come from when you come into this country, you get orientation, and that orientation also give you some key point of people, like Blacks, the background of what is read in that orientation is not a good wording. So some of these migrants, when they come into the country, they already have a fear of being into some of this problem. But to go back to your situation, it's the same thing, the same situation. Businesses, if you start a business as a Black migrant, you're gonna always will have challenges of getting access to capital, loan, the banks. Personally, I started as a refugee, so there is no bank in the world that ever just gonna say I'm going to give a loan to a refugee person that started a company. Only when your company begin to do better, no matter how many words you say. The same things. I know a lot of Black entrepreneurs that I feel from that time. I feel like they could have been gone and being wherever they should be right now. But when you meet them, you see the same struggling. They don't have a push-up system. the bank is not letting, like the same situation. So that has been the experience that I would say I have here. It's been a lot of challenges, but I think recently there's been a lot of change that people are beginning to realize maybe there's thing that people could do together and work together and makes a better and positive thing going on here. So
So, in your social circle, are most of your friends also immigrants, or are they native-born Black individuals?
most of my no, because I went to college here and I meet a lot of people. I start in a group home. Most of my friends are not. I mean, I have everyone from every race. I have African American. I have every person there. So I have a lot of friends depending on what we doing together. And sometimes in college it's different thing from one thing. I mean, I'll be honestly happy though when I started 734 and I raised money, and a friend of mine, his name is Darius Miller, was say, "Man, I'm gonna give you $10,000 to start your project." I was happy because it's like most time you don't get things like that, and it gives you motivation to like keep things going. So yeah.
So, Dr. Green, when we sort of think about social movements right now, we think about Black Lives Matter, which was actually started by a first generation immigrant as well as native born Black people. And when we also think about BAJI, which is the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which was also founded by a Black person and some immigrants, at what point is there an assimilation, or when you talk about this one step down or 1.5 step away, where's this assimilation sort of happen?
Oh man, that's a wonderful question. And I've been sitting here anticipating that type of question. Well, again, I would take this in as a two-pronged approach. Um, like I said earlier, Americans' context of reception and the way in which we construct race in America, Black immigrants, they become Black American by default once they get to the United States. But the other side of that is self-identification, right? We have emerged into a society of cultural diversity where it's more socially acceptable to promote this self-identification of who you are and recognizing and acknowledging all of the components of your specific heritage. You know, people are now saying I'm multi-ethnic, right? Because my great grandfather is Irish, my grandmother is Southern Black, and so forth and so on. But again, to me, I would answer that question. It really depends on who you ask, right? So if you ask, Black immigrants, they would tell you that, yes, I may be Black according to American standards of race, but I'm also, Afro-Latino. I'm Dominican. I'm Jamaican. I'm Haitian. I have this conversation with friends of mine from Miami who are Jamaican, who are Haitian, who are Dominican, who make it very clear that on one hand, yes, I do recognize the constructs of race, but at the same time, people need to acknowledge the fact that I'm more than just my race. I read an article literally today. What does it mean to be Afro-Latino? Right. And then they interviewed the young woman. I think she's a reality star from Miami. I forget her name. And she's Afro-Dominican. And she says she gets, this question from both sides. She gets it from the Latino community asking her, why are you participating in Black Lives Matter? You're Latino, you're not Black. Right? And she says, but no, I am Black. Just because I'm Dominican doesn't exclude the fact that I'm Black. And I recognize my my African ancestry. And so in my research, it really, like I said, depends on who you ask and the context, again, the context of reception. I think region plays a significant role in the way in which, Black immigrants identify themselves. If you're Jamaican and you live in Miami, if you're Jamaican and you live in, New York, then you have the enclave. The enclave is large enough. The Jamaican enclave is large enough to where you can express and promote your Jamaicanness, so to speak. But if you're Jamaican in Georgia, your self-identification oftentimes doesn't mean very much to other people from Georgia. They just see a Black person. And again, that's unfortunate in the way in which America has constructed these ideas of race. And unfortunately, we tend to do that with people of color more so than we do with white immigrants.
So
You know,
after a couple of
we don't.
generations, after 3 generations here, and you're born here, you can still feel like Black people in America are saying they're from Jamaica or they're from.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, like I said, I did my studies at the University of Miami, and I had many students who were third or fourth, however you want to categorize it, third, fourth generation Haitian or Jamaican, and many of whom had never been to Jamaica. But because they lived in Miami and because the Jamaican identity was so rich, you know, they would quickly say, no, 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 I'm not Black. Or better yet, they would say, no, I'm not African American. I'm Jamaican. And then if you ask the questions like, okay, well, you know, were you born in the United States, or have you ever been to Jamaica, or those type of questions? And sometimes, again, depending on the response, you can get a very different type of answer in terms of the self-identification. But I think, again, that regionality, and it works very well for Latino groups also. Puerto Ricans in New York can self-identify as Puerto Rican, and it means something socially and culturally. Cubans in Miami, Mexicans in, you know, in places like, you know, Texas and Southern California, it means something in terms of that self-identification. But when you step out of these particular locales and step out of these enclaves, you know, that Americanness kicks in where, you know, it's, I see race first before I see identity. And I always use this example, and I've been trying to conceptualize this into some type of research project. Amber Geiger in Dallas, she didn't see Botham Jean as a Haitian immigrant. She saw Botham Jean as a Black man, right? And so her reactions to him as being a Black man, again, we try to avoid this conversation about I don't see race, but she saw a Black man. She didn't see a Black immigrant. And so her response and reactions to Botham Jean in that moment was, this is a threat because he's a Black man. You know, and so I think that plays a part into how we conceptualize these ideas of race in America.
So this is for Teresa. This is a question that I didn't sort of prep you on, but sort of looking at the world quotas and having that analysis of knowing what happened in 1965 and then looking at what it created today, was 1965 a mistake, or did we go about it the right way? Was it aligned with our principles of saying we don't really see race or color?
I think nominally, yes. This is a key question, if you will, about disparate impact. You know, one of the things that's being argued today is whether or not giving every country in the world an equal number of visas makes sense when you don't have equal demand from around the world. So moving away from the Black immigrant experience for a minute, the longest waiting lines for green cards right now are from the countries with highest demand. In family-based categories, that's Mexico and Philippines. In employment-based categories, that's India and China. People who apply today in categories from those countries may have to wait 2 decades or longer, 3 decades, 4 decades. Whereas if you're applying from another country that has less immigration to the United States, you could get your green card in a year or two. And that is, you know, is that disproportionately unfair to people from those countries? I think it was ideally to be equal, and it certainly was better than the racist quotas from the early 20th century. But there's probably more to do. The fact that a new visa category of diversity visas was created in 1990, I think was a bit of an acknowledgement of that the structure of the 1965 Act did, if you will, incentivize more immigration from certain parts of the world than other parts of the world, made it harder for certain folks to come in. And I think if we're going to look at restructuring our immigration system, we should make some consideration there for how will the impact be, not just across racial lines, but from parts of the world. Who are we looking to admit, and how can we select them on, if you will, criteria that are more equity-based?
Excellent. So, Mr. Kerr, I think it's interesting that you started your own business. So, can you tell me a little bit about your experience of why you decided to start a business and exactly what your coffee company is about as an immigrant?
Yeah, I started the business because I feel like I come as a refugee in this country, and the idea that many refugees have been looking as a place where you can give them a handout, do nothings. They coming to take a job away from America most time. The story of refugees in the last 5 years, in last maybe 6 to 7 years, become very negative. Even though there was a lot of positive things that have been done by refugees, there has been a way that people have been looking when you from uh, Africa. You know, the advertise there has been uh, a big negative or stereotype, if you wanted to say it, about Africa, people coming from Africa, that they only know how to kill a lion or something. And when you come in from those regions, it look like if you come to America, you can't handle anybody here because no one can kill a lion here. So your help is no longer may not be needed in this country. It also give a lot of room to think that people who coming from those regions aren't doing a lot of good business, and mostly the world is driven by need. Like if you don't need anything from somebody, you're not gonna worry about them, no matter what. So in that regard, to come to why 734 come to exist is that I wanted to be able to do something. I just don't want somebody to look at me. Oh, he coming from Sudan, the place of war. He's looking for a job and all those kind of issues. I wanted to help create job opportunity. I want to be able to just be human being and create my own. Uh, feel like I'm worth something. I wanted to be able to say that I create job. The idea of being coming as a migrant could not stop you to do what you wanted to do, and that I don't want to just be put in a box of being a low-lie migrant and all those kind of issues that well, get the hand out and sit down there. I feel also bad to see that many people live in a group home here in America. They couldn't get opportunity, whether uh, like there's a lot of things that can goes into this. So I start this one to I want to help people, yeah, create a job opportunity back home
So
and here. Go ahead.
perfect. So is this your American dream? And could you tell us about the name of your company? Is this the American dream?
734 is the name of is the company. Yes, it's American dream, but it's something that I feel like I want to contribute. I just it's being a citizen, somebody that can do something. I just don't want to
Well, where
feel
did
like
you get 734 from? Right.
seven 734 is the geographical location of a refugee camp in Ethiopia. So I personally, I was a refugee from Sudan. At a very young age, I run from the Sudan because of civil war, and then I come to Ethiopia, and then moving from one refugee camp to another. So for the long 13 years, I lived in that refugee camp. And when I have opportunity to come here, I feel like I wanted to honor that camp that has been hosting me for that long and remember people that went there. So I named the coffee after a refugee camp, which is also the geographical coordination uh, for that region. So 734
Excellent.
is as a number.
Excellent. Dr. Green. So we just heard from Mr. Carr, and I sort of feel like he's living the American dream. Are there two different American dreams between someone who is native Black and someone who's an immigrant Black? What is this American dream that we all seek?
Uh, well, I mean, again, with sticking with the same theme of the constructs of race in America. One could make a significant argument that, and I think, and I hope I'm not misquoting Martin Luther King here, but are African Americans living the American dream, or are they living the American nightmare? Right? Opportunities historically for African Americans, as we know, have been denied due to stringent laws like Jim Crow laws, segregation, and we continue to see these structural forms of racism in terms of mass incarceration. We see this in terms of corporate America, higher education, so forth and so on. But that doesn't deny the success stories. That doesn't deny the upward mobilities that we can point to in the African American experience. Earlier it was mentioned about the Harlem Renaissance. We could talk about Black Wall Street. We could talk about the very various Black enclaves that are historically have been successful, but we know through again both structural forms as well as direct forms of racism. Those success stories have been limited in some ways. But again, the experience of being a native-born Black American is, fundamentally different. I would argue fundamentally different than a black immigrant, whether that Black immigrant is coming as a refugee or whether that Black immigrant is coming as, a voluntary immigrant from, Cuba or wherever. There are always going to be challenges, and I'll still lean on the idea that race is still going to be a factor in terms of creating obstacles of upward mobility. And we may sugarcoat it into saying it's something else without directly talking about race. But nonetheless, I think the Black experience, whether it be the Black experience in the United States, Black experience in the Caribbean, the Black experience in South America, Africa, Europe, you name it, I think there are some commonalities in terms of the way in which race has been structured and how that limits opportunities for African Americans, or how that limits opportunities, for Black people overall. But we can't deny what Black people globally have accomplished. Everything from inventions to success stories, Madam C.J. Walker, the list goes on and on. But yes, I do believe that the American dream is attainable, but the trajectory to that American dream is not going to be as linear for Black Americans as it is for white Americans, and it's not going to be the same for Black immigrants as well.
Okay. So I want to remind our audience that we're going to take questions later on, and to please send us questions that you'd like to have answered by the panel. And you can do so either live on Facebook or on YouTube. We welcome those questions. Teresa, I want to ask you an interesting question that now the United States has sort of modified its census so that you can check race plus, so you can do Black plus Hispanic or other knowledge. Do you find that information useful, or what do you think the government's going to do with that information? And what about the people who are Black Mexican who have decided for all practical purposes that they're white? Have you sort of encountered any of that?
Yeah, I mean, the census questions are very interesting. From an immigration perspective, immigration researchers use the census data an awful lot to understand about the foreign-born generally, the foreign-born regardless of race. But it's that intersection of the foreign-born and whatever class they decide to check off on that box that is, I think, interesting, because it is about, as what Dr. Green said, that self-identification. And there are a lot of people who argued for that other box because they don't identify clearly in one of those boxes, in one of those check boxes. And so I think for immigration researchers, the ability to, if you will, disaggregate the immigrant experience and hone in on differences by nationality or by race or background or ethnicity, as well as immigrant experience, it is helpful to have that level of data, at least as far as people can self-identify. What's less understandable, I think, and Dr. Green alluded to this, is that to the extent that people don't necessarily have one single identity, or maybe their identity is more nationality-based or ethnic-based than race-based, they may see and live their experience somewhat differently and may not see themselves in the same category as others with the same race. And that's true of Black immigrants, that's true of Latino immigrants. They're not monolithic. And so it is kind of important, I think, if we can, to disaggregate that data and find some ways to examine the differentiators. Because I think, again, if we're trying to understand the different experiences and the ways in which systemic or individual racism has impacted those experiences, we have to have the ability to try to unpack that. That having been said, we do know that the debate over even including citizenship on the census is probably going to have an impact on the response to the census this year, not to mention the impact of COVID. And so one of the things we have to wait and see is what data comes out. What do we actually receive, and how useful is that going to be for future research?
Dr. Green, same question. What's the sort of use of these boxes on the census in your...
Well, I mean, it is also about allocation of resources. and as Ms. Brown just articulated, that people advocated for this to create these multiple check boxes. I believe in terms of the allocation of those resources. Will How do you do that then with particularly with people of color, and you have these multiple groups who now identify with three checkboxes, for example. So how does that affect the resources towards your community in terms of schools, and your community in terms of roads and other healthcare? So like Teresa said, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how things play out once we get those numbers, and once scholars start to interrogate the work. And again, I've been an advocate to aggregate, as Teresa said, to aggregate those groups. But at the same time, again, I don't want to keep beating a dead horse. I just think when it comes to Black people in America, it's been historically difficult, an unwillingness to separate the Black category and treat it as a non-monolithic group. If we're talking, regardless if we're talking about resources or we're just talking about other aspects of the Black lived experience. So again, I'm in a position of let's wait and see what happens.
Mr. Kerr, when your name precedes you, are people surprised when they meet you and they see that you're from the Sudan because of just the unfamiliarity with the name?
Yeah, of course they know that I'm from Sudan. They know that they can even tell through even my English and all that. So people know that I'm from part of Africa, or they may not know I'm from Sudan. So yes, there's a lot of things that that had happened because of those people. Where are you from? Where are you coming from? Those kind of issues. So yeah, people noted that. Thank you.
And when people sort of ask you today about Black Lives Matter, how do you feel? What's your part of that conversation? Is it a global conversation? Do you feel part of the United States structure? What is the conversation around you and Black Lives Matter?
Well, it's a global. It's basically global. I mean, there's a lot of problem Black people have everywhere. You can go to I travel across many part of the world. I mean, it's global. You can go wherever. There's gonna be somebody that just don't like you because you are Black. I, like I went to San Francisco, and this guy was just investor that was going to give us money, and then my name say Menyan Kerr, and I don't know what investor really doesn't read or look to the CEO of the company if it's Black or not, but the Kerr confused him. I think he thought it was Indian or somebody else.
Or Irish? Yeah.
But when I get there, he say, the guy is Black, man. How you gonna run the coffee company? Where the coffee grow in Africa? Started in Africa. So you run into the. I mean, I'm just funny now, but I'm just saying, like, there are gonna be a lot of those situations that seem to be directly toward you because of your race or wherever you come from. So it is global. You could say that it's a problem that it is not just by us, by just it's up and everywhere. Economically, justice, all these things are united in one thing. They are economic power basically. So if a Black people have their own money, they could do. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, let me not just run around, give you a lot of talk.
We have a question from Bob on YouTube, who says, does anyone share concerns, paranoia about the GOP administration intending to let funding run out and starve out USCIS citizenship naturalization functions entirely? So let's start with Teresa. I mean, Director Brown, give us your...
There does appear to be an effort in Congress to prevent USCIS from running out of money. So I think that hopefully they will act, and hopefully the USCIS will continue to be able to do this. But certainly this administration has taken many actions that have limited the efficiency and effectiveness of our immigration system in many different ways. And I think that is a concern. My understanding is that there's a bipartisan piece of legislation that will be introduced that will fund USCIS. So I think it's not strictly a Republican or Democratic issue. It is, but it is, I think, something that this administration has allowed to happen in many ways that didn't have to happen. USCIS is predominantly funded by the fees paid by applicants for immigration benefits, applicants for naturalization. And when those applications have gone down, and as I've mentioned previously, all of the restrictions that have gone in place, their receipts have gone down, and they did not plan for that. So it's policies of the administration that have led to the decline in funding for USCIS, policies that could be changed, but certainly letting this agency run out of money and completely stopping all immigration to the United States would be a tragedy.
Yeah. So when we're talking about these sort of administrational change and we think about the borders, at the southern border, people have a concept of it just being a certain group of people. Who's that group of people from the southern border, and how might they be impacted by this shortfall in administration?
Sure. We have been talking a lot over the last 5 or so years about the arrival of migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border and particularly the increase in migration from Central America. What has been less understood is that a significant portion of arrivals at the U.S.-Mexico border have actually been not from the Western Hemisphere, and a lot of them have come from Africa. So there have been Ugandans and Cameroonians and Congolese and Sierra Leoneans and others who have seen that as a way to try to get refugee status, frankly, in the United States when they could not from wherever they were else in the world due to the declining refugee numbers. And they have been caught in the same policies that have been meant to address Central American migration. Many of them have been sent back to Mexico under the Remain in Mexico or migration protection protocols. And these are people that, for the most part, don't speak Spanish. They may speak French, they may speak English, they may speak whatever their native dialect is, but they are not Spanish speakers. And that has significantly impacted their ability to obtain services and protection in Mexico. And frankly, they have experienced increased levels of violence, crime, and racism in Mexico because they are African and they are Black and they stand out from the rest of the migrant communities that are there. And I think that's an underreported story, that the same policies that have been meant to deter this other migration flow have had, again, an impact on these migrants at the US-Mexico border.
Yeah. Mr. Kerr, in your immigration experience, how long did it take you to make it through the process as a refugee? How long people have a perception that refugees just show up and they appear? How long was your immigrant process?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
A very long time.
Yeah. It's just like becoming a citizen. Yes.
Sure. We have another question from Dennis, and this is going to be for Dr. Green. He always wondered why American society identifies Blacks as African Americans, even when they have lived in many generations. Yet white German immigrants aren't identified as German Americans. So what's the significance of African American?
Well, that really kind of hits into the question of identifying as Black and or African American, where Black people in this country, native-born Black people in this country have gone through several iterations of identifiers, right? We know the racial slurs, Negro, colored, Black, Afro-American, African-American, whereas that same process doesn't apply to what some would say European Americans as opposed to being white. But when you understand the history of, again, the construction of race and where these categories come from, the early immigrants from Europe didn't identify as white. Right? It just didn't exist. That reference didn't exist. If you were from Poland, you identified as Polish. If you were from Ireland, you identified as Irish. And so what began to happen in these early colonial days is that poor indentured servants from Europe were banding together with poor indentured servants who were from Africa. Again, we have this misconception as a side note that early Africans in the United States were enslaved. There were some for a short period of time who were not. They operated as indentured servants. And so these two groups began to band together to fight against the European elite of that time period. And those rebellions were very successful. And, so what began happening, these European elites literally got together and said, we need to do something to stop these rebellions from happening because they were the minority in terms of number. And one of the concepts that was created was this idea of identifying people based on skin color, right? And for Africans, you can easily disidentify them from Europeans because of skin color. And so this is where you hear these early, constructs of race in terms of white and black. Then you fast forward to the 20th century, and again, those names began to change. And so you asked a question earlier about assimilation. For European immigrants, they go through this, Robert Park talked about this assimilation process that take 4 generations. So if you were from Germany, by the time your great-grandchildren were born in the United States, they would just be identified as American. And again, the power of what I would identify as the power of whiteness or the norming of whiteness is we see whiteness as a default, right? We don't see it as a racial category. We don't see it as, in some cases, we don't even see it as a color, right? I always use the example in my classes to this point when we watch television, the show Friends, which is an all-white cast, is never referred to as a white sitcom. But if you talk about The Cosby Show, if you talk about Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, they have always been identified as Black sitcoms. So for Black people in this country, it's always been significant for racist purposes, for resource allocation purposes, to identify Blacks into these particular categories. Again, you got to also remember that Black people, originally were not identified as human. And so, the process of assimilation for white immigrants has always been this linear process. But what's very interesting around late 60s, early 70s, again, ironically, after the 1965 Immigration Act, many white, quote unquote, white Americans began reclaiming their ethnic heritage. And sociologists call that symbolic ethnicity. You do see some white Americans, European Americans who self-identify as I'm Irish American or I'm German American, I'm Polish American, and they do so in a celebratory fashion rather than for social beyond social and cultural purposes, but more so for celebratory, like Irish are very Irish on St. Patrick's Day, that type of thing. But for African Americans, you can't. For whites in America, they can turn on and off their ethnicity because race is so powerful, because we normalize whiteness in America. But Black people from Africa, Black people from Central and South America, Black people from the United States, Black people from Europe can't turn off their skin color. So it's one of those processes that's it's very easy to identify that group over there as Black, or that group over there as Latino, or that group over there is Asian. And because it's been identified specifically with skin color, because we have to remember, Asians originally were called yellow people, / Oriental. Native Americans were identified as red people, again, because of skin color. And again, just the power of race in our society, it just doesn't, the rules do not apply the same to European immigrants. And so they can come here and be born here, raised here, and be 5-6 generations removed, and just simply be identified as white. There are Japanese who have a legacy of 6 generations in the United States, and I just said it. I didn't say Americans. I just said Japanese, because we have to use that identifier first when it comes to non-white groups in America.
Teresa, one of the interesting things about American history, I guess we talked about the Harlem Renaissance, is sort of this migration that happened of African Americans from the South to these larger cities. And then what we sort of study within the migration of people from around the world, we also see these immigrants also have large numbers in these same cities that native-born Blacks moved to. What do you find interesting about that?
I think what's interesting is that the ideal of cities like New York City, which is probably, known as the immigrant city in the United States to most Americans. It's where the Statue of Liberty is. It's where an awful lot of immigrants, at least from, Africa and Europe, first came to the United States in the 1800s and later. Is that people move there for all of the same reasons. It was seen as a place of freedom, a place of openness, a place of opportunity. There were jobs, there was prosperity to be had there, and there were communities already existing that could help you. And so in New York City, especially, the diasporas from many places around the world created the neighborhoods in New York that a lot of New Yorkers are very familiar with, of immigrant communities and African American communities that helped each other. And one of the interesting things is the extent to which, for example, and I'm interested to hear from Dr. Green his knowledge on this, how Black immigrant communities to New York integrated with the African Americans who had moved north to New York and contributed to that renaissance. It's not something that I think is studied a lot, or at least not made known to many people in their education, but that's an important contribution there. And you see it now, and in some ways the migration back south. There is a migration happening back south, and a lot of immigrants are moving not to New York City, they're moving to Texas, they're moving to Florida, they're moving to Georgia, they're moving to North Carolina, they're moving to Arkansas, because that's where the jobs are, and integrating with various communities there in various ways, and sometimes better and sometimes worse. So I think that's to me the interesting thing is seeing that the movements of people are for many of the same reasons.
Dr. Green, would like to
I
let you
agree.
also.
Yeah, I agree totally with that assessment, and especially with, as she said, this what's been termed this remigration down south to a lot of the large metropolitan cities, and Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham. You're seeing an overwhelming number of not just Black Americans moving back down south, but as she said, a lot of Black immigrants who are relocating, excuse me, to these locales and establishing themselves as within these neighborhoods and these communities, to the point where it's embraced, and you see Caribbean celebrations, the Caribbean festivals, and you see the immersion of the Caribbean groups with native-born Black groups, this cultural appreciation and cultural acceptance of the two. But I would also add to that, even though this is being this remigration, and there's this social and cultural acceptance of difference, I still see and find in the research that the self-identification is still significantly important to Black individuals, because again, it means something socially and culturally to say that I'm Haitian or I'm Haitian American.
Mr. Kerr, so you first entered the country in Richmond, and now I believe you're in Washington, D.C., is that correct?
Well, yes.
And so what made you leave Virginia, or have you always sort of lived in the Virginia, D.C. metro area?
No, I always live in between DC and Virginia, so I'm still in both places. So yeah.
But what drew you to, as we refer to as the Chocolate City? What made DC the appropriate place for your business?
Well, DC is a policy making, and the refugee become a hot topic throughout the world in the last 5 years. So I wanted to see if we can make a difference within DC, because I work internationally, and so everything that require policy is in DC area. So Virginia, yes, of course, is good and fun in Richmond, but there's not a lot of things that are international happening in Richmond. So most policy change maker or decision maker are in DC, and plus it's fun there. So I like it. It's fun city. You can go out and.
Dr. Green, are there different experiences for Black immigrants? Do Black immigrants have an easier time sort of assimilating to the U.S. than others do, or?
Easier, I wouldn't necessarily say easier. Um, I would just say different. Again, when you look at, are we talking about Black immigrants collectively, or are we talking about Black immigrants from various parts of the diaspora? Again, it kind of goes back to, yeah, it goes back to that conversation of did you come here voluntarily? Did you come here as a refugee? But I do believe that um, with what I've termed like this explosion of Black migrant patterns since 2000, really since 2010, it's creating better pathways, and the transition. I foresee the transition becoming better and easier for many Black immigrant populations. And like I said, this capital matters. Social capital, human capital. Are you coming here with traits that are valued by the United States? Do you have higher education? Do you have skilled labor? And so if you come and possess those particular human capital traits, I think your transition would be smoother than those who are transitioning with limited traits, little education, those type of things.
Mr. Kerr, do you have any family currently in the United States, or did you have family when you arrived here?
No, I didn't have any family. I come as a refugee and I was put in a group home, so I have to start it all over. It's a new beginning. So it was kind of,
Okay.
but yeah.
Has any of your family since migrated to the United States?
Well, I have a relative that come here before me, like a while ago, and he live in New York. So he has a different experience and my different experience. So it hasn't been like I didn't. So there's not like you try to get your family together, but it's very hard. There's not a family out here. It was fun, but I like it.
Teresa, in your study and research, have you sort of seen a different experience between Black immigrants and other immigrant groups with regards to how they either provide help back home financially or migration patterns to the United States in your studies?
I think that Black migrants, as well as migrants from many places in the world, if they're coming here for opportunity, and they're successful and they better themselves, and they have family back home, one of two things happens. They will try to see if they can help family immigrate to the United States with them, to follow them, or to help and send money home. Many immigrants come and get an education and maybe invest and build a life here, and then go back home and start businesses or international trade, like Mr. Kerr is developing international trade with the countries that he is from in Africa and other places to help support the economies there, as well as fellow refugees here. So I think that is definitely part of the immigrant experience, whether you're a Black immigrant or anyone else. The drive to support the community that has supported you, if you will. I think the ability to do so varies, obviously, by how successful people can be in the United States. And I think that, the limitations, for example, that Mr. Kerr experienced as both a refugee and a Black man in the United States can inhibit that. Advantages also ascribed to people who come who are highly educated and middle class and go through the university system here. And they may be able to be a little more successful in doing that. So there are as many individual stories as there are individual immigrants, and it's a little hard to say as a group, but I do think as a group, immigrants are usually looking at how they can support others in their situation.
And does that include moving to, Teresa, how many people sort of in your studies, do you have sort of a number, even Dr. Green, that sort of become residents and then become citizens? Do you have the sort of statistics between full integration to voting or just being here as a resident among the African diaspora of immigrants?
I'm afraid I don't have that breakdown. I would say that in general, again, you have to have a green card for at least 5 years in most cases to be eligible for citizenship. And the percentage of eligible green card holders who get citizenship varies between 40 and 60%. And a lot of that depends on financial ability, education. Language is the big inhibitor, that people who are not having a language. A lot of Black immigrants who come from English-speaking countries have an advantage there. and so maybe more likely to gain citizenship over the long term.
Dr. Green, do you have anything to add to that in your studies? Have you seen any different sort of patterns of migration at that level?
I'm with Director Brown. I'm not sure about the actual numbers. I did want to kind of add on to what she said previously about this pattern of helping, family members back home. There's a significant population of immigrants. We have this belief that immigrants are coming here, taking our jobs, living off the government, all the stereotypes that we associate with immigrants, regardless of whether they're Black, Latino, it doesn't matter. But the reality is, as I said, there is a significant population who are middle class, there's a significant population of white collar professionals, and there's a significant number who go through this process of transnationalism. And that is what more or less the official term, where they come here, they may stay for a number of years, but they go back home, or they send money back home, and it's this transnational pattern that is very significant. This is inclusive of Mexican immigrants. We have, again, the stereotype that Mexicans are the ones who come and taking all our jobs, and so forth and so on. But many, I think as of 2010, I have to double check the data. I think as of 2010, Mexican migration patterns are declining because of this pattern of transnationalism, of coming here, staying a few years, and going back home. I just wanted to add that little piece there.
No, that's important. That's super important to sort of talk about the whole sort of perspective of what it means to be an immigrant and to sometimes return, which I think is also similar to some of the migrant patterns of Blacks that were born here. They moved north, and now they're returning to some of those home states in
Absolutely.
the South. Mr. Kerr, what is sort of how did you find native-born Blacks? Did you find them welcoming? Do you find them welcoming today? Has there been a different experience throughout your time here at college? Was it different? In DC, was it different? Was it different in Richmond as a kid in sort of those grade school levels?
Well, naturally, you're going to relate to people that you see that are going to be close to you. If you go to college, you're going to ask somebody that you feel like they may understand what you are talking about. So it gets you become, friend with, get you to become friend with African American here, because they know more than experience. They know more. I mean, I can tell you one experience that was very unknowing to me. So when I come here, I joined a high school, and then I did really good at it. And one friend, her name is Kelly Cooper, I didn't know the culture at the time. She has to run with me, and in the field, she go and she was running a little bit, and then she had very long hair, so she take the thing that she tie her hair with, and then she take it out. She say, "Do I look good? Can I run like that?" I say, "No," and automatically she run away from me for 2 weeks. I didn't know what happened. And the idea is, so she didn't talk to me. After 2 weeks, she talked to me, and she was like, "You are mean." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, you didn't tell me I didn't look good." And from there on, I learned how to, when you see somebody, you tell them you look gorgeous, you look pretty, you look this, you look that. That is a culture you only learn through those things. Well, in refugee camp, really, this thing doesn't, when somebody asks you a thing like that, it doesn't mean anything. It just mean can I, and my English was bad at the time. So it was a learning experience that think that culturally you're going to tend to people that you will feel comfortable asking those little fun questions that you don't know. That's the point why I brought this question up. It's like you're going to get talk to somebody that has been here more than you do, or speak a better culture than you do a little bit.
Yeah. So in DC, in your business circles, when you come encounter with other native-born Blacks who have businesses, do they perceive you as different, or are you just perceived in the brotherhood?
Well, you can, like I say, you can't really put every people in one place. There are people that will say some things different. There are people that say, "Man, I like this Africa coffee. Man, I gotta get this coffee." I mean, there are people that are generally wanted to help me and take me to some of this business and some deal that I get because of African American guy is there. When I went to the meeting, I look at the room, I'll be like, yeah, this one look like African American. Is he gonna help me out? You know, there's some kind of there's some kind of feeling that you get. You even if you lose the deal, you feel like, man, I think he trying to help me, and then it didn't work. So, but when you go somewhere and look foreign to you, you're wondering, what can I do now? You know. So there are a lot of things that, regardless of what happened, it's like you're gonna relate to things that you don't even know. Sometimes I relate to somebody, I don't know why I relate to this people, somebody like that. So it helped, yes.
So, Dr. Green, at the university, as a professor, you encounter different Black immigrants from the diaspora, and as well as this is part of your subject area. So why is this your subject area, and what have you seen the experience differences between Black immigrants at the school and native-born Blacks at your college?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Well, I got into this was not my field of study when I went into graduate school. I was focused more on, factors that contribute to academic achievement among Black males, and that was going to be my, source of dissertation work. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Seth Swartz, who was one of the directors of the Center for Family Studies at the University of Miami. And as his research assistant, he did a lot of work on a number of different measures, looking at differences within and between Latino groups in Miami. Sexual behavior, drug use, so forth and so on. As a graduate student, I was just there to run the numbers, whatever he needed me to do. And I remember specifically at one meeting, they were talking about all these different things and these different variations of, the findings that they had and future research projects that, again, we're looking at, Cubans versus Dominicans, Dominicans versus Puerto Ricans, all within, South Florida. And I just simply asked the question, I said, well, why aren't you all focus on the diversity of the Black population here in Miami? It's just as diverse. You have Bahamians, you have Jamaicans, you have Haitians, you have native-born Blacks. Why are you ignoring this population? I believe that this is a rich source of data that, for what you all are researching, could be something that you can look into as well. And he simply turned to me and said, well, why don't you do it? And I kind of said under my breath, I said, that's not my work. But I did take his advice, and I began to do my own, independent research and reading, and began to uncover, a wide, rich, literature on, this question of Black identity. And one of the first books that I read was Mary Waters. It came out in 1999. And that just kind of launched me into this trajectory academically that took me away from, the work that I was originally doing for my dissertation. And being in Miami, again, you do see those variations of students. There was the Haitian student organization, there was the Jamaican student organization, there was the Cuban student organization, there was Black Student Union, which was primarily Black Americans. So it was very different. And for me, being from North Carolina, it was initially weird because my whole concept was, well, you're Black. It doesn't really matter that you're Haitian, doesn't really matter that you're Jamaican, but it did in South Florida. And so the experience at that university, at the University of Miami as a graduate student, yes, it really did mean something, socially, culturally, academically, for these different groups. And since my tenure at the College of Charleston, we don't have as many, and it's not as diverse in terms of the Black population, but what we do have is a large Gullah population. And they have their own, cultural, social distinctions that may be very different from other Black Americans throughout the state of South Carolina. Gullah population along the Georgia, Florida, South Carolina coast, and everything, again, from food, linguistics, but it's very significant in studying and understanding Black people throughout the United States, because Charleston was the hub, it was the port. Over 40% of all enslaved Africans that came to the United States came through the port of Charleston. And the Gullah population is, distinct in terms of, holding on, the population that holds on to their African ancestry closer than most other Black groups in the United States. And so I get that population of students. And it's even interesting among some of them who want to disidentify with being Gullah and more identify with just being Black American or African American. So there are some differences that you see, but for the most part, here at the College of Charleston, the vast majority of our Black students identify as Black or African American, but it would be one of those who would say, I'm Black American, but my grandparents are Gullah, something like that.
Oh, thank you. Teresa, I think you're going to get the last question and sort of lead us into the final conversation for the group. How can refugees and immigrants experience better social inclusion when arriving in the United States?
That's a really important question, and it's one that is it's relevant for all immigrant groups. One of the things that the United States does not do that other countries do is that we don't have a national integration program. Immigrants who arrive to the United States, for the most part, are on their own to figure out. The refugee population, as Mr. Kerr said, does get an orientation, a little bit of a taste of what they can encounter, some cultural acculturation before they come that's sponsored by the State Department. But most of the immigrants who come to the United States don't get that. And so it's on local communities, it's on their fellow immigrants in diaspora, it's on family members, employers, school districts, and everyone else to help them acculturate. And since there's not a national program and it happens sort of haphazardly, the experience of inclusion is diverse as the populations and the places in which people arrive. And so places where immigrants come that have a long tradition and history of immigration tend to have more of an infrastructure for integration of immigrants into those communities. Places that have newer immigrant populations have less of an infrastructure and so have experienced various difficulties. I think it's one of the things that we need to pay attention to moving forward. And having those integration experiences be culturally relevant to the migrants who are coming. So, for example, as we've heard tonight, Black immigrants to the United States have a somewhat culturally different experience than immigrants from other parts of the world. And how can we ensure that we are culturally appropriately helping them to integrate and succeed in the United States? There are a lot of community organizations that are doing this. I think one of the things is, as Dr. Green mentioned, a lot of these immigrants are forming their own groups, whether it's the Ghanaian immigrant organization in a city or the Cameroonian group or whatever. A lot of it is formed around religious organizations or civic organizations that help these immigrants establish themselves and support themselves going forward. And groups like Mr. Kerr, who are helping other refugees do better, both in Africa, in Sudan, and here in the United States. So I think it's something that we should think about as a policy measure for the United States going forward. I think the United States as a country, we do better when we help those who come here do better. And it's something we should think about how we can improve, certainly.
So I want to take this opportunity to thank the entire panel, Dr. Green, Mr. Kerr, and Director Brown for your insight, your study, and your time. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kimberly to end our sessions for today. And I also want to thank the audience for listening.
Thank you very much to all of our fantastic panelists for this really important discussion. Thank you to everybody who joined us on YouTube and Facebook for participating in the conversation with your questions and comments. We hope you guys will join us at our next discussion, which will be about the immigrant integration experience, which will be the last of our series on October 14th. We'll release that information soon, so if you sign up for our newsletters or follow us on social media, you'll get the latest updates. See you soon.